Hello students, welcome to week 6 for COM 403. This week we are looking at media ecology and rhetoric. When you look at the week 6 agenda, you'll see that we are reading chapters 22, 24, and 25. We're going to watch 5 different videos all related to media ecology and rhetoric. A couple of them help explain the major overarching concepts of rhetoric and media ecology because they're two different disciplines within communication, and then the other two relate specifically to the theories and concepts we're looking at this week. When you're done watching the videos and listening to this lecture, you'll need to complete discussion board number 6, which is due on Friday, with replies post due on Sunday. In addition, you will complete reaction paper number 3 this week. When looking at reaction paper number 3, it's important to see that we're focusing on the theory of the narrative paradigm. Within that, there are 6 different things that you'll be addressing in your reaction, your critical explanation and defense or critique of the theory. Again, this is a 4 to 5 page written paper that does not include your abstract and your title page. That's in full APA style. So when I'm looking at your paper, I'm looking at 4 to 5 pages of written content, not the reference page included in that, not the abstract, and not the cover page. It's important to understand that. As you're working through your critical reaction, meaning your analysis and synthesis and evaluation of the theory, you'll need to explain, apply, and critique the theory that we are covering, which is the narrative paradigm, and presenting your reaction in a cohesive and well-written format. To do that, there should be at least mentioning of the text, as well as at least 1 to 2 outside sources to accurately and effectively reach that exemplary grade to this paper. So in looking at that, make sure that you look at all things related to the narrative paradigm. I'm asking you to explain the difference between the rational world and narrative paradigm, as well as some of Fisher's thoughts in terms of coherence and fidelity and narrative rationality. So it's very important that you really go through thoroughly what the text says about this theory, this lecture, that I give you a thorough explanation of the theory, and the videos that will help you in understanding that. It's important to pay attention to the major overarching concepts of rhetoric because this theory is founded in the rhetorical tradition as well. Discussion board number 6 actually helps you work on looking at the rhetorical tradition and what rhetoric is in terms of a tradition within communication theory. So in essence, it sets you up to thoroughly understand what's needed in your reaction paper to be able to critique the narrative paradigm. There are 5 things that you're doing in your thoughtful and analytical answer to this prompt. In a sense, I'm asking you to just give me an overarching perspective of what rhetoric is, what Aristotle's thoughts were on it, as well as the 5 canons in rhetoric. All of this information will be found in the rhetoric section of the text, which is chapter 22, I believe. In addition, the videos provide some really good perspectives that help kind of bring some visual elements to the major concepts you'll be reading within that chapter. When we look at media ecology, it's important to understand that it is the study of different personal and social environments created by the use of different communication technologies. When we look at that, it's important to see that we are taking ourselves out of looking at the ritual of communication, the transmission of it, and we're looking at the technologies we use to communicate. So we're kind of moving outside of our realm of looking at how communication influences one another, and instead we're looking at how communication technologies begin to influence how we communicate as humans. Any understanding of social and cultural change is impossible without the knowledge of the way media works as environments. By evaluating the ecology of media is a difficult enterprise because all environments are inherently intangible and interrelated. An environment is not a thing to identify. Rather, it is the intricate association of many things. By definition, these things are part of the background. They are everything and no thing. We're going to look at Marshall McLuhan, who was noted as saying that there are ground rules in pervasive structure and overall patterns that elude perception when it comes to the invisibility of media environments. Understanding that means that we really need to look at the symbolic environment that surrounds us from this ecological perspective of media. Simply put, that symbolic environments means that it influences media because it considers the social construction of meanings, as well as the sensory world of meanings within the world of media technology. So changes in technology typically alter the symbolic environment, the socially constructed sensory world of meanings that in turn shapes our perceptions, experiences, and attitudes and behaviors. So think about this. The use of social media applications and our smartphones and things like that, that's a change in communication technologies, have significantly altered the symbolic environment in which we communicate. That's the socially constructed sensory world of meanings that have in turn shaped our perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of life. We now thrive in an instant world of instant communication, instant contact with others. It's very, very important to keep that in perspective. As we look through a lot of the information related to media ecology, it's important to know that there's a media map of history. There are 4 eras of communication technologies. The first one is the tribal age. This is the age of an acoustic era at a time of community because the ear is the dominant sense of organ. Information is passed down through hearing and listening rather than reading. The next one is a visual era known as the literary age, a time in which a private detachment because the eye becomes the dominant sense organ in terms of how we interpret media and communication. The next one is the print age. Continues this idea of the visual era, but it alludes to the idea that the mass-produced books usher in an industrial revolution and nationalism, and yet individuals are still considered to be isolated. Printing is an idea in a way that helps spread information quickly, and we become more attuned to the prototype of the Industrial Revolution and looking at the printed press. The electronic age is the age and the era of instant communication, a return to this notion of a global village with all the at-once sound and touch. So when we think about this, we're going to get into the global village in a minute, they really are saying that right now we're in this age because each era overlaps each other of a print electronic age, where the dominant technology is still the printing press, the actual printed piece of communication, but we're moving into an electronic age where we're fully rooted in using electronic communication devices as a primary source of communication. So we're in this transition as of now. When we think about this, and before we get into this a little more deeply, we really need to understand who Marshall McLuhan was. He was known as one of the greatest mass communication theorists of his time. Ironically, it was not his area in his first profession or his academic area of study. He really worked as a professor in literary analysis and English, and he found dabbling in this area of mass communication as a hobby. And what ended up happening is that somewhere along the lines, his noteworthy papers and academic hobby research, if we'll call it that, focused on mass communication and ended up being one of the reasons what he was founded for and known for the most in communication. He coined phrases like the global village and the medium is the message, and he did this in the 1960s. And so if you think about that, as we start to explain that, consider that, because in the era that we're in now, they mean even more, and they even have even more relevance than they did when he first started to use those phrases. He is noted as saying that he fell into this area of being a mass communication scholar because he was fascinated with new technologies. He thrived off of the idea of, at the time, the television, this one-room computer, and the phone, and connecting us and how we communicate with one another. That was in the 60s. He felt that all new technologies and the influence they have on our lives was fascinating. The thing of the nature is that when he started predicting these things, this was in the 60s, you know, where it was 50 some odd years before we actually started to see the full breadth of what that meant. The main thing he's noted as being popular for is this idea of technological determinism. It's his idea of what technologies do to the people. So according to McLuhan, human inventors enhance human communication. In a sense, his theories of media differ from the traditional warnings against technological advances, but he says that it's not technologically abnormal that our demands and attention focus on technology in terms of communication. Instead, we need to focus our everyday experience of the technology. A medium shapes us because we focus on our everyday communication that partakes over and over and over, becomes an extension of ourselves. And now, if we look at what the medium is, it emphasizes different senses and encourages different habits and engagement based off of the technologies that we're using to communicate. So he felt that technology is an extra force introduced into society. Really what he would say is that it's not what we're saying, it's what we're using to say what we're saying. He had this huge notion, which is true, that humans communicate the same things over time throughout history. What we say to each other doesn't necessarily change. Families have the same issues day in and day out that they did in different eras of time throughout history. What it is, it's the technologies that we're using to communicate and how those technology influences those situations that really, really put a whole force into this idea. It was more of that the technology that we use is more deterministic of how society functions than the communication we're using to say it on those devices. So I'll say that again in a different way to make that a little more clear. He said that it's not what we're saying to one another that is influential and shapes society. We've been saying a lot of those things in different ways throughout time, but rather it's the technologies that we use to drive what we're saying, or is the vehicle or the medium we're using to communicate that speaks volumes into what is influential in society. So those smartphones that we're tied to, that we pull out at any moment when we're waiting for our coffee at Starbucks, or in the pickup line to pick up our kids, or whatever it may be, says more about what is influential in society than what we're using to say off of those devices. Because husbands and wives and families and brothers and sisters and friends all communicate similar things across time. The message and the idea of what's being said hasn't changed through generations. Instead, it's the technologies that we're using to say those things that is influential. And so that's really kind of what media ecology looks at. It looks at the idea of what the technologies we're using is being in terms of deterministic in how society functions, and analyzing that from those perspectives. Raymond Williams put it this way: technology cannot determine a cultural or social outcomes, as technology is merely the extension of human capacity. Rather, it's the way we use them. So to look at it a little more deeply, McLuhan had this idea of the medium as the message. And it may sound a little different or whatever it may be, but McLuhan's theory of media ecology is best captured through this phrase. He would say that we need to consider the medium that we're using, so for that technological deterministic perspective, consider the medium that's used to communicate before what we actually consider what we communicate. So it gets into that notion that I was explaining. It doesn't matter what you say on the phone or in print or watch. It's the medium that you're using. The fact that I typically binge most of the series that I watch, or I catch up on the series that I watch on Netflix or Amazon Prime or through HBO or whatever it may be, on my phone, usually when I'm waiting in the pickup line to get my kids because I'm trying to get there 20 minutes early so I can get a good spot, says more about what society is than what I'm actually watching, because we've been watching television shows for the last 50 years. So instead of tuning in at 8 o'clock because it's live and then it's gone, I can watch it whenever I want and when it's convenient for me. McLuhan would say it's the medium that's the message. What I'm using to stream those shows is the message about what matters in society, as opposed to what it is we're actually watching. And so that's the concept of the media is the message. It's really the framework of his ideas of media ecology, and he's known as one of the fathers and pioneers and pivotal, influential scholars of media ecology, so it's important to keep that in mind. His concepts of the global village also extend to have high relevance in terms of how we look at the historical eras that we talked about a little bit ago of media history. So if we look at the tribal age, the literate age, the print age, and the electronic age, we can see that there were different dominant sensory receptors at each point. We've already covered that: the ear, the eyes, the ear, and the eyes together. Well, the global village considers a worldwide electronic community where everyone knows everyone's business and all are somewhat testy about it. Electronic media brings us in touch with everyone, everywhere, and instantaneously. Whereas a book in the print age extended the eye, the electronic circuitry extends the central nervous system. Constant contact with the world becomes a daily reality. So the global village was a phrase he coined in 1962. Very, very, very interesting in terms of how it's been theorized and come to fruition today. McLuhan really felt that in the new age of electronic communication, at the time only considering television, radio, and phone, was instrumental in shrinking the world to the size of a village. We live in this huge global atmosphere, but with electronic communication, and at the time he was talking about television, radio, and phone, today we talk about a lot more, has shrunk the world to the size of a village. So a small village allows for instant communication, whereas a world would not. And as we look at this, it's important to see how that's instrumental and revolutionary in how we address the small world feel our smartphones, our social media applications, and things like that bring to us in our perspectives of understanding society and influence in terms of how media can be influential from those perspectives. As we move forward and we look into the rhetorical traditions, we shift gears in terms of looking at a different tradition of communication theory. Rhetoric as a tradition in communication theory is humanistic and an interpretive way of thinking. So most of the theories that you come across when you're looking at the rhetorical tradition significantly are housed in the area of the interpretive type of theory. Very few of them are objective because of the nature of rhetoric is really an identifiable tradition of thinking and talking about communication. We look at common communication topics within this tradition that consider the audience, agency, argumentation, identification, and persuasion. It's considered with how people throughout history conceive the nature and the scope of rhetoric, particularly considering how the theory and the practice and critique of rhetoric extends to the tradition. So when we look at the rhetorical tradition, we're considering, a lot of times we're considering narrative, functions, and things of that nature. And particularly, the course text spends a lot of time in looking at Aristotle. He was a student of Plato in the golden age of Greek civilization that really came to the idea of looking at the place of public speaking within Athenian life. Aristotle, like Plato, deplored a lot of the dramaturgy of speakers using their skill to move an audience while showing casual indifferences of the truth. But unlike Plato, Aristotle saw the tools of rhetoric as a neutral means by which the orator could either accomplish noble ends or further fraud. So by using the justly, one would do the greatest good and the unjustly would do the greatest harm. Aristotle believed truth has moral superiority that makes it more acceptable than falsehood. And so when we look at this from a perspective of speaking, speakers who neglect the art of rhetoric have only themselves to blame when the hearers choose falsehood. Success requires wisdom and eloquency. When we look at rhetoric, we're discovering all possible means of persuasion. So looking at all available means to persuade means that we have to look at many different proofs when it comes to rhetorical analysis. And this has to do a lot with logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos is a proof that considers the logical means in which we derive an answer from a persuasive speech or persuasive communication artifact. Ethos deals with the ethical applications, and pathos deals with the emotional applications. A logical proof comes from the line of argument in a speech or communication artifact, whereas the ethical proof is the way the speaker character is revealed through the message, and an emotional proof is the feeling the speaker draws out of the hearers. So in some form or another, we need to look at that when we consider all theories within the rhetorical tradition. When we consider the narrative paradigm, it's important to see that it's a concept in the communication theory that was developed by Walter Fisher. This concept is adopted from the oldest form of communication, which is storytelling. He stated that all meaningful communication is in a form of storytelling, and people's past experiences are influenced by our need for communication and also our base of our behavior. Thus, the narrative paradigm is very helpful in analyzing the nature of human communication. A narrative, by any means, is any verbal or nonverbal interpretation which is arranged logically to generate a meaning. The communication process is influenced by the experiences and other factors from the past. The concept upholds the idea that communication happens between a narrator and the listener in the form of a story. So the narrative paradigm is really looking at the oldest parts and adopted through the idea of meaningful communication in the form of storytelling. We're deriving on past experiences or influences for the need of communication and communicative behaviors. It's any type of interpretation of the story that's generated by meaning in terms of the narrative. Specifically, the narrative paradigm works with two principles: coherence and fidelity. Coherence deals with any content while communicating is effectively only if it makes sense to the listener. So you're looking for the coherence of how it makes sense to the listener, and coherence is the degree of sense-making of a narrative. So coherence again deals with the degree to which of making sense of the story. The effectiveness is in delivering a story is influenced by three factors: the structure of the narrative, the resemblance between the stories, and the credibility of the characters. So how somebody determines coherence or narrative coherence within the paradigm looks at the effectiveness in delivering a story. Particularly, they're looking at how the story is delivered through the structure of the narrative, the resemblance between stories, and the credibility of the characters. Narrative fidelity, the second principle, which is fidelity, defines the credibility or reliability of the story narrated. It is greatly shaped on persuasion of the listener, whether the person accepts the story or not. A set of values is followed for accepting the reliability of a story. The fidelity is attained by following a series of questions. Are the events described really factual? Has the facts been distorted while narrating? The reasoning patterns followed while narrating. How does the argument in the story affect the decision-making of the listener? And how are the importance of the stories being narrated? Or how important is the story being narrated? So when we consider those questions and we look at the fidelity, the truth, the reliability, and the credibility of the story, we look at the persuasion of the listener and the persuasion of the narrator, the narrative elements of the story, to accept it or not in terms of it having fidelity. Some people feel that the narrative paradigm is a broad concept in human communication and is almost impossible to conduct a study. However, to contradict this, the concepts of many philosophers believe that communication is not always a narrative. For instance, a fantasy story cannot be a narrative, as it is out of one's imagination, and it will alter the principles of narration, such as the structure and reliability. Others differ. That's just one critical perspective of it. When we apply the narrative paradigm, we need to know that it's an innovative concept which reveals the nature of human communication, while considering communication as a form of an array of events. The people judge its credibility by understanding the reliability of the narrative, and the studies can further be developed in understanding the human communication mechanism and applied to various fields. So when we consider it, we need to know two main things of the narrative paradigm. It is a concept within communication theory that focuses on the art of storytelling. It's important that we look at as all meaningful communication comes through this idea of storytelling. It's very interpretive and relies on ritualistic communication. To determine how the narrative paradigm is working accurately, we look for coherence and fidelity. Coherence deals with the effectiveness of delivering the story, where fidelity deals with the credibility and reliability of the story. How accurate we feel it is, how much it relates to a particular area within our lives or within the lives of other humans, and so on. It's important that communication aimed at maintaining relationships like the narrative paradigm, rather than passing along information or saying something new, is very influential in terms of how we interact with one another in interpersonal perspectives. As we consider Fisher's ideas, we should remember that the narrative paradigm offers a fresh reworking of Aristotelian analysis, which has dominated rhetorical thinking and communication for years. His approach is strongly democratic, and people usually don't need specialized training or expertise to figure out if a story holds together, offers good reasons for believing it to be true, and has fidelity and coherence. However, it's important to know that when we evaluate the coherence and fidelity, people with ordinary common sense and competent rhetorical critics can apply their own personal perspectives to it. Fisher's theory itself is a story, so you might expect that not everyone accepts his tale, but it's important to know that there is value in looking at the storytelling aspect of communication and how it is influential in how we communicate as humans. As we look at the Week 6 agenda, it's important to keep in mind that we're reading chapters 22, 24, and 25. We're watching 5 short videos related to the rhetoric, media ecology, the narrative paradigm, and McLuhan. It's very important to keep in mind that we need to complete discussion board number 6 no later than Friday, with replies due on Sunday, and reaction paper number 3 by Sunday. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to me early in the week. I look forward to interacting with you and pray you all have a blessed week. God bless.